Uzķēršam, preparējam, aizšujam. Tāda ir mēdīju anatomija.
Oksfordas Universitātes paspārnē strādājošais Reuters žurnālistikas pētījumu institūts katru gadu veic pasaulē lielāko pētījumu par cilvēku, ziņu, lietošanas, paradumiem, kā arī par Mediju, darba, izmaiņām. Pētījumam gan ir limiti, piemēram, tas neaptver Krievijas un Ķīnas mēdījus un mazā tirgus dēļ arī nenotiek Baltijas valstīs. Tomēr tas jau kopš 2006. gada pēta tendences un jaunumus mediju vidē visos kontinentos. Mediju anatomijā šonedēļ saruna ar vienu no pētījuma autoriem un digitālo stratēģi Niku Ņūmanu. Ar viņu sarunājās Zane Ozoliņa.
Do you find that people still need the news? Do they trust the news in 2024, but did they in 2023?
I think that journalists look around the world and what's happening in terms of the uncertainties, political uncertainties, economic uncertainties, and take the view that journalism has never been more important. But what the audience evidence shows is that many people are sort of turning away from the news. So either disconnecting and accessing it very rarely, or deliberately avoiding certain subjects, partly because it makes them feel depressed. So over the last 5 years in particular, we've really seen the sort of decline in consumption.
Your survey covers a lot of territories, like almost all the world, all the continents. How do you describe the picture there where people still trust journalists and journalism, and when there are some worrying trends?
And what we've seen is a mixed picture, but in large countries, particularly countries where you've got more polarized politics like the United States, United Kingdom, France, big countries where we've really seen divisions open up on culture, on politics, we've seen a decline in trust, a very significant decline in trust in almost all those countries. In a few countries where there are, particularly in sort of North Europe and Nordic countries, so Finland traditionally always comes out top for news trust, we haven't seen those same declines, and it's been pretty stable actually over the last 10 years. So it's not happening everywhere, and it's quite interesting to look at where trust is declining, where it isn't, and it very much is tied in with these sort of really divisive debates that are going on around culture and politics. And it's partly because people see things in the media that they disagree with strongly, and they often blame the media, who particularly public media like yours are trying to represent all views, and people feel so strongly about one side or the other that they end up blaming the media company.
Yes, that is true. Here in Latvia, we are. I think the public media gets to be blamed most of the time. Like, you don't know how to do, you are just wasting the taxpayers' money. Is that a tendency all over, that people are criticizing more and more and judging media because they have a feeling, I know better?
When you ask people about, media criticism, and we did this last year in the report, we see that in most countries, people see a lot of criticism of the media and of journalists. They report that they see it in social media primarily, but also through traditional channels and politicians talking about it as well. So, it would have been unheard of 20 years ago to have a politician, or not unheard of, but very rare to find politicians directly criticizing the media. But now it just happens all the time, particularly with populist politicians, and public media is often number one target, either because they want to influence that public media politically, or because the public media still carries quite a lot of influence and has a lot of reach, and so is the number one target for politicians because they think that they can influence their editorial line by criticizing them. So there's just a lot more of this around.
Recently, there was an alarming article on the New York Times, which has, they had data about all the elections happening this year, and they would say that it's going to change the world. That is, like, we will wake up in a different world because of the elections, which is partly 20% of the population all over the world. Does this change the especially the American elections, the UK election, European Parliament, the large-scale elections, do they have an impact on how media work and how people are seeing the news?
Yes, I mean, there's been a lot written about this because, as you say, there are a lot of elections. I think 40 really significant national elections in some of the largest countries in the world this year, US, India, Indonesia, European elections, as you say. I think it's going to be really interesting because what we've seen in our survey is declining interest in politics, and people actually feeling that politics is not, and politicians and what they do is not so relevant, that national politicians can't necessarily change these big questions like climate change. They have less power than we thought they had, and so we take less interest in them. So there's lots of stuff going on there, and it will be really interesting to see whether these elections actually stimulate that interest again. Normally what we see is when elections come around, people sort of spend a lot of time engaging with what's happening and who's going to win. But increasingly, I think we see whole parts of the population, a lot of younger people, just sort of saying, it's not relevant to my life. Whoever wins, they're not going to help me. And so I think that sense of powerlessness is really a challenge for politics and politicians, because they are losing touch with parts of the electorate. But it's also a challenge for media companies. Part of the role of media is to be part of that democratic process, laying out, helping people to understand what the choices are in elections. That's a key part of the role of media. And so I think it's quite existential, actually.
Do you see there's a part of that with the war in Ukraine and now in the Middle East? Because I know the politics wasn't part of the survey, but we have this fatigue of the news as well. And it is mostly about Ukrainian war, because we were so hyped up and, following the news at the beginning. And now people are just tired. And also what you mentioned, the feeling that they have no way of impacting things and they are just turning off news altogether.
I think individual stories, it's always been the case in a way, long-running stories, it's hard for the media to engage people with, it's easy at the beginning because it's new and different, but when it grinds on and there's no solution, people feel powerless and they often turn away from these kind of stories. And Ukraine's part of that, and I think the Middle East increasingly is becoming part of that. In our survey last year, we saw, really interesting, that people living in countries closest to Ukraine actually are seeing the biggest amount of news avoidance of Ukraine. And I think that's partly because the media companies in those countries are still doing a lot of coverage of it, and that's not matching necessarily where the public is on that. So it's not necessarily that people aren't interested, but it's just like it's everywhere in the media, and people, they hunger for something else, more diversity, more range of stories, something else to think about. And some of that is just sort of natural human reaction.
And one aspect that you also pointed in the survey, that people are not really anymore following news outlets or media as such, but more looking for these influencers. And that is, driving in despair media managers, like what to do. Do we have to make all the journalism stars, or are we too late in the game? What is the race here?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because to audiences, it often doesn't matter where you get the news from, as long as you find that person is trustworthy. And so a lot of it comes out in the sort of individual and the personality. And so we're seeing personalities becoming not necessarily more important than brands, but in some cases more important than brands, because those are the people that young people trust and listen to, and those are the people they find engaging. And this works in lots of different ways. In the Ukraine war, for example, you have a lot of amazing academics or people who've studied Ukraine all their lives building up huge followings because they actually often know more than the journalists. So there's sort of positive and negatives from an information point of view. I think when we talk to young people about this, they don't want journalists to behave like influencers. They want journalists to do what journalists do. They want them to do it maybe in a more accessible way, and in a way that in a different tone of voice, but not to lose the values of what makes journalism different. So it's challenging.
What are the trends in the way people are getting the news, or the programs or podcasts. I found it interesting in your presentation for Riga that the WhatsApp is top one in a trend how to reach the audience now.
Yeah, so I mean, a number of things. So first, I mentioned already that one of the big trends we've seen over the last 10 years is the decline in traditional sources. Now, that started with print, but it's increasingly television news and broadcast news. So we're really seeing an acceleration in that decline, particularly with younger users. And then within digital, the big change we've seen is the rise of alternatives to websites, really. So, and within social media, we've seen this shift, which started, a few years ago, away from the big social networks like that everyone used, like Facebook and Twitter, for example, for news, to a much bigger range of news. And there's so many different options now. So again, fragmentation and the rise of closed messaging apps like WhatsApp, where the discussions are less toxic quite often because they're in smaller groups with people you like. So that's one of the reasons why people have started to discuss all kinds of things including news within WhatsApp. And that's not in every country, but in most countries, WhatsApp now is a major source of news. And in some countries like Africa, in Africa and India, for example, it's really significant, and it's where a lot of the political discussion happens. So it's not a universal picture. It's slightly different in different countries, but the general trends are moving away from these big open networks like Facebook and Twitter into more closed environments. And then the rise of short form video networks like TikTok and YouTube, which is also focusing more on short form now, is another sort of really interesting trend right now.
It would be amazing to have easy answers. That's why I'm asking about the trendsetters. But could there be one part of the world or America with the elections coming up, which would be in the focus of attention? Will they set the new trend in the means of all the media things, including misinformation?
There is no silver bullet. There's no single answer, and it almost certainly won't come out of the United States, or at least what's appropriate in the United States context won't necessarily work in a Latvian context or in a Norwegian context or whatever. I think there's lots we can learn from the US, and obviously that is where a lot of the innovation is happening in artificial intelligence and in news business models. But to be honest, I think particularly for small countries, as much of the learning can come from looking at Norway or Sweden or other countries which are also hugely entrepreneurial, very ahead in terms of using new technologies like AI to make content more relevant, and are probably more relevant in terms of the business models because they're about small markets rather than large markets. And it's very hard to apply something that works in the US necessarily to Latvia directly.
Speaking of the business models, is it still relevant to think about media as a source of successful income, to invest in it?
I think if you sort of take a historical perspective on this, news was never necessarily that profitable if you go back a long way, and it was often just a way in which powerful people could get influence, was owning a newspaper. that was that, and then you had this sort of golden period where news suddenly, because of the monopolistic way in which it was very expensive to own printing presses and do the distribution, actually news was extremely profitable for a long time, both television news and print. And then the internet arrived and created all this new competition and this idea that news should be free and should not be paid for. And so you've had this massive plunge in profits in most parts of the world. And what we're really trying to do, or publishers are trying to do, is to rebuild business models for this new world, a world of abundance where you have to create something that's distinctive, of value to users, and increasingly, sell it directly to those readers through subscription or membership, or some combination of that and advertising and events and a range of different business models. So that's where we are. And I think a lot of, publishers like New York Times and other sort of particularly upmarket publishers have found quite a lot of success with that, and I think have a clear path to the future. I think that a lot of mid-market old style newspapers based on on how things worked in the past are really struggling and are going to continue to struggle, and a lot of local news is going to struggle too. So we haven't found the answers to what the business models are going to be for a lot of independent local journalism, for example.
I have a little bit personal question to you, because you have been the head of the product development at the BBC, and you were there where they were making the news website, right? Can you compare those two milestones with what's happening now? Was it easier to predict then?
I think it's very hard to predict the future. And certainly we launched the BBC News website in 1997. And most of my colleagues thought we were mad and it would never work. It would be a flash in the pan, that it was going nowhere. It took probably 5 years for the rest of the organization to take this seriously and see that digital was going to be an important part of the future. And now, of course, the narrative is really leaning into digital first, or even a world where digital is not even mentioned. It's just taken as read that when you're creating linear video, it's going to be digital at its heart, and digital distribution is going to be at the heart. So the world has completely changed in 25 years. Having said that, I do think the sort of long-term trends are often much clearer than we think. So, the long-term trend to, direct payment, for example, as an important business model, the long-term trend towards mobile, the long-term trends right now towards, the disruption of artificial intelligence. So we know what the challenges are. Actually knowing how you respond to those things, requires a lot of thought, because the world is much more fragmented. Audience behaviors are much more fragmented and hard to predict.
Are you looking at how artificial intelligence is going to disrupt the media business models?
Yeah, I think it's the thing that I'm asked to talk about at media conferences most. I mean, if you go to any media conference, it's all about how is artificial intelligence going to disrupt. What I've learned is that we tend to underestimate the long-term effects and overestimate the short-term effects. So people, it's not going to happen immediately. It's going to be quite slow. Audiences are going to take a time to adapt to these things anyway. But the technology is here today to allow you to, to write stories in new ways, to use artificial intelligence to summarize things, or to simplify your production processes. And media companies are already, embracing this as our platforms. So the platform environment is going to change. Ordinary people are going to do it faster. So this is why we're going to have this flood of synthetic content more generally affecting misinformation. And much of that won't come from media companies. It'll come from ordinary people who now have access to these amazingly powerful tools.
You mentioned the ordinary people, that media are not moving fast enough for ordinary people. And media journalists and owners just have to become ordinary people to win this game.
I think it's a mixture. I think you don't necessarily have to be first, but you have to mix, what it is that is valuable about the heritage and the vision, which is probably still going to be relevant in the future. Audience behavior is changing really fast, and traditional media companies are really slow at making that change. When we started the BBC News website, it was set up as a startup, essentially 30 people in a loft, and we had very little contact with the rest of the organization. It was deliberately set up that way so we could disrupt the culture. Otherwise, the culture of the BBC and of television and radio would have taken it over and smothered. What we needed to create was new ways of telling stories. And so for 5 years, we were able to be, digital creatives, if you like, and to break all the rules. And, and only now is all that being absorbed into the sort of the core. And I think that's a really important lesson, that sometimes you need to break the rules and bring different people in and have more diversity in your staffing to really be able to make the change that you need to make.
Dzirdējāt sarunu ar Niku Ņūmanu, Reuters žurnālistikas pētījuma institūta pētnieku un digitālo stratēģi. Raidījumu Mediju anatomija veidoja Zane Ozoliņa un Reinis Budze.
Uzķēršam, preparējam, aizšujam. Tāda ir Mediju anatomija.